Okay, thank you so much for inviting to this. I'm really happy to be here talking with you. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously this is a very critical moment in time. And I'm from, I grew up in New York City. That's where I'm from. That's where I live. I haven't been there for a while. I've been in Europe. I'm in Vienna right now. But obviously, I've been like monitoring what's happening in the U.S. and in New York very closely. I have to admit that I don't even know if it's like, I mean, some people who possess, kind of white skin and privilege are, backing off from making public statements right now and feel that it's really a time for, other voices to be heard. And I sympathize very much with that perspective. But here I am talking, which is kind of what I do. It's what my career has been, what my profession has been, and thinking, and sharing, and so on. So, I will kind of begin by going back through kind of my personal history and my work up to the present day, and then address some of the, main ideas that we've been just, that I know you've been focusing on for this series. And as I mentioned, I grew up in New York City. My parents were artists and writers. My mother had been part of a movement called the Beat Generation in the 1950s. She was a young woman who got involved with Jack Kerouac for a while, ended up writing a memoir called Minor Characters about the Beats, who were kind of like a prefigurement of the hippie movement, who were very early on in exploring like drugs, consciousness, and so on. And yeah, so I grew up in sort of a radical left-wing perspective. My mother had edited a lot of 60s radical books, like one by Abby Hoffman called Revolution for the Hell of It, and books from the Black Panthers movement and so on. And, I went to college in Connecticut. I had grown up also with a scientific materialist worldview, which was kind of like the leftist default perspective. This idea that, kind of from Marx, this idea of a materialistic concept where, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of biology, of matter, that it developed kind of as a result of increasing complexification through a total evolutionary kind of accidental process. That's what I grew up believing. And then as I got a bit older in my 20s, I was working in media in New York in magazines. I began to have a kind of classic kind of existential crisis of value. And I felt that the value of the culture that I was ultimately kind of not only cynical, but ultimately kind of nihilistic. And I became interested in environmental topics. I wrote a piece for Esquire magazine that was about the decline of the sperm count around the world, which I learned was due to chemicals like estrogenic mimicking plastics and pesticides and so on. And the way that article got received, was mostly like it was laughed off. I found that anyway. So I became more and more concerned about ecological questions, and I began to realize that there was a fundamental incapacity of people in the sort of media art world that I was part of in New York from kind of addressing these questions. And I realized that had to do with the nihilism that came from the materialist belief system. This idea that, in a way, life was totally meaningless. Consciousness was entirely brain-based. When we passed away, that was the end of any form of identity or soul or consciousness or spirit. So I began to ask myself how I knew if this was really the case. It was something that was like the received wisdom of the scientific materialist and academic establishment. And I remembered that I'd had some psychedelic experiences in college that were the most significant in suggesting that there were other forms of consciousness, maybe other dimensions or levels of reality. So I decided, kind of in a state of despair, to make these the subject of my kind of investigation. At that time, it was like the late 1990s in New York, and you literally could not talk about psychedelics without being ridiculed in normal circles. They were totally dismissed and derided in the mainstream. So, but since I was a journalist, I was able to get some assignments. I went to do an initiation with Bwiti in Gabon, using the substance that's sacred to them called iboga. which is also now known in the West as ibogaine. It's one of the only kind of naturally occurring psychedelics. I think that's used like that in that part of Africa and equatorial Africa. And it's now being used as a treatment for addictions, for heroin addiction and so on. I also visited who use ayahuasca as their staff.
Daniel, your video seems like it's cutting out a bit. I hope it's not our video.
I got thrown off for a second.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? I got thrown off for a second.
Yeah, we lost you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. We lost you when you were talking about when you went for a visit to visit people that were doing ayahuasca.
Yeah, I'm back on now.
Yep, go for it.
Okay, cool. So that experience, first the African experience, then the experience in Ecuador, became the core material for my first book, Breaking Open the Head, which came out in 2002, which kind of explored psychedelics and the visionary experience and tried to understand why the modern kind of industrial Western world had demonized and suppressed these experiences and what the value of them were. And I looked at it from many perspectives, from like anthropology and cultural history. I looked at thinkers like Walter Benjamin and Aldous Huxley and so on. And I also had many experiences that were kind of very inexplicable from the modern rational materialist perspective. And these included sort of psychic experiences and even kind of occult experiences that to me were kind of phenomenological demonstrations that reality was much more multi-layered and that the psyche was more paramount. Essentially I shifted from a Freudian materialist kind of perspective to more of a Jungian perspective, that there are these kind of archetypes in the collective unconscious, that the psyche is not just inside of us, but somehow we're part of a process that's happening within the collective psyche. I ended up kind of embracing Eastern metaphysical ideas that, maybe ultimately there's only, kind of one consciousness that's telling a story, splintering itself up into all of these separate individual beings to learn about its own creative capacities. And at the same time, as I was writing Breaking Open the Head, I learned that many kind of traditional civilizations, indigenous cultures and communities had a prophetic understanding of this time that we were entering into as kind of the end of one cycle, the beginning of the next. The Aztecs and the Maya talked about the age of the fifth sun, transitioning to the age of the sixth sun. The Hopi talked about the fourth world to the fifth world. The ancient, Hindu culture talked about the Yuga cycle, the Kali Yuga. And then, of course, the Judeo-Christian monotheistic tradition talks about this idea of like the apocalypse, kind of a new world, coming into being. And, I did begin to feel that this kind of archetype of the apocalypse, of this kind of transformation, was something that seems to actually be occurring kind of in our time and in our lived experience. And, we're seeing many indications that we are in a, totally unprecedented period in our human existence, where we're seeing this rapid evolution of technology, this communications tools like the one we're using now, which is connecting the whole planet into like a giant kind of central nervous system or collective brain, plus the acceleration of the ecological destruction which is collectively threatening our future. Yeah, and then also I would say, as a result of globalization, we're seeing also kind of all these religious and mystical traditions kind of mix and mingle together. And we're seeing also more and more of kind of new paradigm forming that is based on kind of recognizing that science and mysticism are no longer sort of contrasting against each other, but actually that it's possible to think about a unified paradigm where the experiments of quantum physics in the 20th century seem to very much indicate that consciousness is not just a kind of epiphenomenon, that actually consciousness in quantum physics experiments is required for the wave to collapse into a particle. Somehow consciousness itself seems to be intrinsic to the nature of reality, the nature of materiality itself. So this led me to a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, where I was looking at prophecies of ancient and indigenous cultures from around the world in relationship to our time, and also thinking about my own experiences that I continue to have working with groups like the Santo Daime in Brazil and so on, what those kind of meant in terms of these transformations that are happening. After completing that book, I tried to put ideas into practice. I started a company called Evolver that published a web magazine, Reality Sandwich, and also we ran a nonprofit called the Evolver Social Movement, or the Evolver Network, that basically tried to create a template for organizing local community groups around kind of new ideas, transformational practices, permaculture, local currencies. At the height in 2011, I would say we had about maybe 50 to 70 local groups. Some of them were, we're doing like local festivals or kind of incubating local currencies and so on. So that was a really exciting experiment, which we could never figure out how to properly make work financially, which ultimately led to it kind of kind of not working over the long term. But then I was still very much brooding. I felt that the 2012 book, I had kind of looked at the scenario that we were in from a sort of philosophical, metaphysical perspective. But then I was really thinking about what this type of transformation that we need to have meant in more of a material and social terms. And that led me ultimately to write a third book, How Soon Is Now, which was kind of investigating, kind of like the ecological crisis that's underway, and then thinking about what would be a system design approach to changing human society to deal with it. That book came out in 2017. And yeah, I mean, I guess in that book, which I think that book is the most applicable to the subjects that we're talking about here, I really was looking at it from a systems design perspective. Like people like Buckminster Fuller were very inspirational and influential. And I ended up breaking it down to kind of like the three levels, the three areas in which we would have to transform civilization. One being kind of our technical infrastructure, areas like agriculture and industry and energy production. Those would have to become, regenerative or sustainable. And then I looked at it in terms of the social systems, like the economic systems, the governance structures, and how those would also have to be transformed to kind of allow for the technical changes to happen. And then the third area was consciousness itself, which is kind of involves media, education systems, mass media, which in a way programs the collective consciousness. How those would also have to be changed, those systems, to allow for the social changes and the technical changes to happen, almost like three kind of big wheels that all turn at the same time. That's kind of, led me to my present day thinking, and kind of I guess what I've been working on most recently is a course with my friend Rory Spowers, who's a systems design thinker, who also wrote a book about climate change called Rising Tides, and who puts together a local food festival in Ibiza where he lives. And so we're working on a course called Building Our Regenerative Future, with this idea of trying to create a full-scale paradigm for people in areas like food, health, economy, culture, community, and consciousness, so that people can see how all these areas work together and the types of changes that they can make locally that actually would positively impact their lives even in the short term, and then how those connect to larger changes, by regional and even global changes that have to be made. Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe it would be easiest for me to take a question at this point from you guys, and you can tell me, what of this seems most trenchant and valuable to you.
One question that came up is that just where we are in the conversation. A lot of the initiatives that you wrote about in your last book. I think some of the things you mentioned was like local economies, or even things that you worked on earlier on with Evolver. How did that experience of working on those things and thinking about those things and writing those things become renewed or more relevant for you? Is that something that you have you had any aha moments in terms of how those things could be implemented differently now to really take root in the world, like whether it's alternative currency or community food, food sheds, local food sheds. Yeah, just interested to see like what your reflection is on some of the things you tried and some of the things you've done in the past, and how perhaps now you would take a different approach, or just even talking about some things that worked and why they didn't work. Like one of the things you mentioned was some of those community groups that came together at the height. There was 60 or 70 community groups that came together, and it didn't really work for financial reasons. So I'm curious what what some of the restraints are, for us to maybe even explore what some of the restraints are. There's so many good initiatives that struggle with being able to be financially sustainable, and I don't really know of any non-fiat currency that has taken off in an explosive way that's really led the way for or maybe perhaps crypto, but even that is still on the fringes. Like, yeah, so just interested to hear your thoughts around what we need to do to overcome some of those restraints and some of those obstacles, and how we can get more local initiatives to really take root. So it's a really long question.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the problem that we're facing is the the capitalist economic system, which really doesn't encourage these types of initiatives, and in some sense doesn't even like allow them to really flourish often. It's our currency is debt based, and the system is oriented towards constant growth. I mean, even when you go to the United Nations SDGs, one of the mandates, very, very strong, like 7 or 8% growth or something for developing countries. Yeah, so the whole system is based on this, exploitation, extraction, growth paradigm. And it's hard within that to organize initiatives that are kind of, countering that by, I think what's going to happen in the near future is these initiatives that have not been able to scale in the past are going to start to become, in some regions of the earth, more available simply out of necessity. So right now we're seeing like a huge, kind of increase in mutual aid, local mutual aid networks, neighborhood networks, and so on. Local currencies have really, they haven't really scaled. I mean, the problem is that all of the advantages are still going to the big corporations, which are able to kind of game the systems for their advantage. But I think the United States is obviously going to be like this very crucial battleground in the near future. I mean, we're seeing obviously with the protests right now is the unbelievable kind of hyper-militarization and hyper-securitization of US society, which has been happening for decades. I mean, 9/11 was obviously a time when that amped up, and now it's amping up, much, much further. I mean, the police, Trump has been allowing the police to get military grade, weapons in 2017, tanks and so on. The U.S., I mean, the New York City budget for the annual budget for the police is $6 billion, which is going to beef up this massive kind of paramilitary kind of organization in a way, and not going to help communities, not going to help public health. I mean, we're seeing these incredible kind of, the differential between the security forces and the equipment that they possess, the fact that the nurses and the doctors in the US who are fighting the pandemic couldn't even get basic protective gear, and were often kind of wearing plastic bags and so on, to counteract the virus. I mean, it's just horrendous. Cornel West has been speaking about how the United States is like a failed social experiment. And I think he's correct. As a result of the pandemic, I think it's 40 to 50 million people in the U.S. are now newly unemployed, and a lot of those people were part of what's called the precariat, a class that was only being able to survive kind of month by month. And we know that 40% of people in the U.S. only have about $300 worth of savings, which is almost nothing, and don't have any reserves to deal with a medical emergency. If you get the coronavirus and you don't have insurance and you have to seek treatment at a U.S. hospital, the average cost of that is like $30,000. So, I mean, it feels like the U.S. system is actually breaking apart at this point. I mean, this, kind of monstrous kind of apparatus of exploitation and control. At a certain point, it's either going to kill everybody, put everybody in prison, or it's going to have to go through some type of transformation. And in that period of transformation, that this sort of awkward and dangerous period that we're entering, there is also a lot of educated, well-meaning people in the U.S. And it may be that it becomes kind of a hotbed for all sorts of different alternatives to flourish. Like alternative economic models, like kind of mutual aid-based communities. But obviously, also people have almost no practice in this at some point. I mean, I guess that was when I started Evolver, like in 2008. I was very aware that we would be coming to this breaking point at some point, just looking at the ecological data. And I wanted to figure out how you could prepare, let's say, like an advanced guard of people to, understand what's coming and have, mechanisms in place to, help people, like midwife, in a way, kind of the new cultural shift. I mean, a deeper question. I just watched the Rebel Wisdom, some of the Rebel Wisdom festival last weekend, and my friend Doug Rushkoff was speaking, and Rushkoff was saying that almost like at this point, if you are fully aware of what's going on, it's almost like maybe rather than midwifing, the new paradigm, it's almost like palliative care. It's like there's the model now, kind of like deathbed care for this old civilization and this old culture. And I know that you're speaking to me from New Zealand, which seems to be one of the perhaps, even the best kind of modern Western culture that, has kind of integrated its indigenous heritage. And, maybe it's not quite as destructive there. I actually, don't even know. I mean, I know that, for instance, yeah, just like the lunacy, the insanity of the system that we've created, through the inertia of this kind of industrial growth over the last couple centuries. You look at a place like Hawaii, which should be an ecological paradise, and they import, almost all of their food, and export almost all of their trash. Um, so yeah, we're definitely in for it, in a sense, in terms of how far behind we are in terms of making the changes that we would need to make globally to deal with the scale of the ecological emergency. And to be totally honest, like, I'm not even convinced that the human species is going to survive this threshold, that we may actually be on the verge of bringing about our own extinction, and it could happen faster than we wish, than we even imagine. It could be, however, it's also possible that we do engineer an alternative, and the focus becomes, as fast as we can, creating topsoil, destroying ecosystems. Somehow this has to move from the periphery of human awareness to centrality, and it has to become kind of a global movement. And it's so far from that right now. I'm hoping in the U.S. the protest movement that's coalesced around police violence and murder of Black people, which is now growing larger and larger, becomes actually a kind of transformative social force that embraces the necessity of profound economic and ecological systemic change. So yeah, we'll see what happens. So I don't know if I've really answered your question. I've drifted a little bit, but these are I guess the issues that are paramount on my mind right now, and my focus. I think that crisis does lead to things that were impossible suddenly happening. As the Second World War forced the U.S. to shift all of its manufacturing, in a few months, to wartime production, and suddenly find a way to tax the wealthy at 90%. That's the kind of full-scale initiative we need to deal with what's happening ecologically. And it probably has to be both bottom-up and top-down kind of movements, where, I've also been, very enthusiastic about aspects of Extinction Rebellion and their approach to kind of creating a global civil disobedience movement to pressure governments to kind of deal with the truth about climate change, admit the truth about it, shift towards creating a carbon neutral environment even in the next 10 years, and also creating a mechanism for citizens' assemblies that actually have an oversight capacity on the government, and can be given all of the data, like almost like juries, and then sift through and decide on what those policies have to be. So yeah, so I guess at this point, I think we do need local community models, and those are obviously crucial. And efforts to build off-the-grid communities, to create communities where people are, moving more into balance, becoming more self-sufficient, creating more of their own food, and so on. Although obviously, the urban environments are in some ways have ecological advantages too, because actually people who are in dense urban environments are actually utilizing less resources often. And so, a major focus has to be on, redesigning urban environments so that they're more ecologically resilient and self-sufficient and produce more of their own food. I made a documentary in 2010 called 2012, Time for Change. We interviewed aquaponics experts. So I think we're saying that if every rooftop in New York City had a rooftop garden and aquaponics, you could grow something like 60% or more of the food that New York needs right on the rooftops. So yeah, I guess for me, the question is, how do you find, it's like we almost need to find a median between kind of local initiatives and the scaling, exponential scaling capacity of modern industrial civilization, which could, mandate things like local rooftop gardens or, biochar, which is a way of producing energy that creates carbon-rich tilth based on Amazonian practices, or mutual aid networks. Yeah. So how can we use the creative capacities of technical efficiency that in exponential scaling that have been developed over the last centuries, but apply them to a system that actually would allow us to survive for the long term and to thrive, and that also kind of addresses the unbelievable levels of economic inequality and social injustice that have been created by the system. It's possible, but it's a tall order, I guess. You guys want to toss me another question?
This is, sorry, I was on mute. What was what did you say the title of your first book was?
Our first book was called Breaking Open the Head.
Breaking Open the Head. Yeah. I mean, just hearing you speak on this is yeah, it's interesting for me to reflect on it. And yeah, even I guess one question that comes up for me personally around what, where we're, like, I guess where we're going with this conversation sounds like a very familiar space in terms of how people are trying to solve this. And I'm curious as to with the explorations you've done into consciousness, the question that comes up for me is what is the mind that's needed, or what sort of, who do we need to become to be able to engage with the world, and what sort of, yeah, engage with or move forward with changes that can really make a difference and take root. I don't know if I'm expressing it in the right way, but yeah, it's like it feels as though we're so gripping to the ways that we've solved problems in the past, and we're treating this as another problem to solve, like whatever it is, wherever we are. And like I guess it's a real palpable experience change or step change or a shift that needs to happen, where we don't look at the world as a problem that needs to be fixed. And yeah, I mean, with some of the work and the explorations you've done into consciousness, I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on how can we, if we want to be regenerative, part of being regenerative is to work with all our body. It's to be holistic is a big part of being regenerative. How can we approach things from a whole perspective, even if it's just on a whole body perspective? How can we shift to approaching the world from a perspective that maybe that would definitely be breaking the habit of how we've gone about it before? Like one thing that that comes up for me is, I don't know if you ever read the books of Thayun Marez. He's a Toltec teacher who often talks about changing the assembly point, like the way that we view our world, and changing that paradigm, that assembly point. And oftentimes in those traditions, there's a lot of various medicines that can help us do that as well, but not that it's also not necessary. But it feels as though like that's a critical aspect of being able to step into a place where we can truly address these problems, is the state of consciousness that we're at the moment.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And you know, I guess the answer is that it's complicated in a way. I mean, and we don't know the answer. I mean, you know, consciousness is not a static thing. It's, you know, it's a becoming process, and you know, you kind of, you know, evolving one's own consciousness or the planetary consciousness or the collective consciousness involves a lot of trial and error and a lot of failure and mistake. You know, there's definitely been a kind of, you know, in let's say the transformational culture movement, you know, people go to festivals and practice yoga and take raw food. You know, there's tended to be a shying away from kind of political and social engagement, and in a sense that until that you've healed yourself and your consciousness, you know, you can't really contribute, you know, positively. And yeah, I mean, and I do think there's something to that. I mean, you know, in my own life, you know, I got very, very focused on, you know, the ecological crisis and wanting to build structures to help with it, but I hadn't actually addressed, you know, some of my own shadow material, you know, particularly around sexuality that was based on like stuff that happened to me in early childhood and so on. And that, you know, came back with a vengeance because I hadn't integrated or dealt with it properly. And so yeah, there's definitely, you know, whatever we can do to become whole, you know, and it is a process. But you know, the opposite extreme that I often see is people who are like, you know, I'm not going to take action, you know, with, you know, in any particular way until, you know, I've drunk ayahuasca another 50 times and done another 10 Vipassana retreats and, you know, healed myself through, you know, these diets and so on, you know, because I don't think that healing is ever a complete thing. You know, there's you know, we're mortal, fragile beings, and there's no state of absolute wholeness. You know, and then also from, you know, kind of you know, let's say that, you know, kind of Eastern metaphysical perspective, again, they talk about how, you know, samsara is nirvana, and you know, everything is actually perfect, you know, as it is. You know, if you know, if the gods had wanted us to have dealt with these problems, they would be dealt with. You know, whatever invisible forces are behind the scenes, you know, are completely want us to be having exactly this struggle and this tumult and this crisis right now. You know, so you know, and whether that leads to the extinction of the human experiment, or whether it leads us to another, you know, maybe more incredible, more amazing stage in our growth towards consciousness. You know, we don't really know yet. All we know is that we're embedded in this story right now, and you know, we have to deal with it with the tools that we have. You know, with the cumbersome words that we have, with the with the programming that we have, and so on. And yeah, I mean, you know, it may be that, I mean, I'm also, I'm a huge fan of the whole concept of the assemblage point, in the sense that, you know, if we now know that consciousness is more kind of built into the structure of the reality that's manifesting, then of course, as we change our consciousness, and our level of self-development and spiritual development, then the whole manifestation may also change around us. This is also something, I mean, I was able to do a couple of retreats in Colombia with the Kogi and the Arawak people who live in the mountains of Colombia. And when I was able to kind of reduce their like absolute core message they were trying to convey to us as outsiders, or what they call as the younger brother. They talk about their civilization as the elder brother. But this kind of core idea was that, yeah, like the reality that we experience is a direct reflection of our level of self-development, spiritual development, consciousness development. So that's all true, but it also seems to be that, sometimes the true development happens through kind of like being tested, through going through types of initiatory processes and tests. I mean, in a way, it can be very comforting. You can even find your comfort point, with ayahuasca, where your ego has kind of assimilated the psychedelic experience, and so you're comfortable even with the negative parts of it. And in fact, now we're seeing. I mean, I've been seeing people who I thought had maybe gone through some evolutionary development process through medicine journeys and so on, still adopting very, very bizarre conspiratorial political ideas that are not, to my mind, helpful or evolutionary at all. So yeah, these medicines in themselves are not cure-alls. I guess nothing is really a cure-all. We just have to keep kind of learning how to investigate and explore our own systems of belief and our systems of knowledge. I mean, one thing that the modern West really seems to be lacking is a kind of coherent kind of like epistemology, right? Like I see a lot of people grabbing on to different ideas. Vaccines are bad. Bill Gates is an evil monster. Trump is actually part of a deep state effort to defeat the pedophiles, behind the scenes, but then they lose the capacity to make a discernment between kind of ideas that they've absorbed from all sorts of sources and kind of more like evidence-based understanding. And it's very difficult to do that. And it apparently turns out that a lot of indigenous cultures were more embedded in their language, and their philosophy was a more kind of like epistemological rigor. Like they would always be aware that, reality is a process. And that what we claim as certainty is never actually much certainty at all. We just know, I know that I'm in this room right now. I know that I'm, using my voice, speaking to you in a distant land, but do I actually know for reality what's happening outside my window right now? Is there a world there today? That's, that's evidence-based inference, but, so how do we keep, going back to questioning our epistemology so that we don't get trapped in beliefs that take us off in wrong directions,
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to remind people who are tuning in that, feel free to ask any questions you might have, whether you're on Facebook or in the Zoom chat. One thing I just want to follow up on from what you were just talking about, Daniel, is this kind of delay or this holding off from acting. What you're saying about waiting until I did, more ayahuasca or Vipassana retreats before I can act. So what would you say to the person right now, someone in the United States or somewhere where there's this uncertainty around them? They don't know if they're going to be working or if they're going to be able to see their family. They don't know. They want to act. They want to do something positive. They don't want to hold off and wait until, somehow miraculously they're healed. But they don't know what. They don't know where to go and how to act in this landscape of uncertainty. What would your advice be to someone on the ground right now who wants to know how to channel their energy in a positive and purposeful way?
Um, I would probably say that you would either look for, kind of local community groups that seem to reflect your interests and your perspective, or if you can't find them, maybe you would even try to start one. Yeah, there's different movements. I mean, there's one called Symbiosis, which is kind of an effort to create like a local democratic infrastructure in the U.S. Obviously, there's kind of social justice movements like Black Lives Matter. Once again, I feel this kind of regretful sadness. I feel like what we had put together with the Evolver Network, although there is an offshoot of the Evolver Network, which is also still doing this type of work called the Bloom Network. Symbiosis. And that's that's one that people could create chapters of, but it doesn't seem to be incredibly active right now. Okay, here is Symbiosis. Yeah, so you look for local groups that you either want to join, or if you can't find any, then maybe you start something just with your friends, your immediate community. It could even be that you join a group like, let's say Transition Town, which was a UK social activism model, or Extinction Rebellion. I guess that would be that's an option. I mean, I just actually, Extinction Rebellion has just issued a new US manual, and they've created a model for people who want to start local chapters, who can get the information there on how to host local chapters. And they've created a very structured model where there's an initial talk about how to understand the potential for extinction and mobilize against it. And so you can either have a regional representative deliver this talk locally, or learn how to give it yourself, gather a few people together, and then they give you the steps to create your first local action. And the model that they're using is a year of kind of local organizing and action leading up to next spring, where they want to do large-scale civil disobedience in Washington, D.C. So that's another organization. So you have to find something that you really gravitate towards, morally, spiritually, philosophically, and then get on board and help them. And then, as I mentioned, there's mutual aid networks. You can see if you can find a local one. Yeah, I guess those are some ideas.
Yeah, and that's sort of like political, physical, in the world action. And what about when you're talking about integrating the shadow aspects of ourselves, or working on ourselves to also be able to act in a more kind of integrated way? What would you say to someone who's curious about how to do that, and how to go about doing that in their lives?
Yeah, I mean that's a very individual kind of journey. I think it's hard to generalize. I mean, there's so many, kind of tools that are available, but they're also not available everywhere. There's seminars on dealing with personal trauma, with collective trauma. There's workshops on doing kind of shadow work. There's traditional psychotherapy and psychology. There's journey work. There's shamanic work even without medicines, like just shamanic drumming. These are often available in people's hometowns, in whatever their kind of local, new age or spiritual center is. I mean, there's meditation, family constellation work, EFT, emotional freedom technologies. I mean, there's a lot of different modalities, and once again, people have to kind of find their own inner journalist and investigate and explore which of these types of modalities they feel most affinity to and resonate with, and then integrate them into their lives.
Cool. One of the we've spoken a little bit about a fair bit about the restraints and the capitalist system, and the way that we've been moving, and the things that are that are obstacles and some of the different methods to overcome those. But I'm curious for you personally, like what do you see as the potential of this time? What are you excited about, or what are you seeing in the world that kind of lights you up and I guess gives you, I know you mentioned that you have somewhat of you're open to the belief that we're not going to make it as a species, and that's certainly a possibility. But yeah, just wondering for you personally, like what do you see as the potential of this time? And
I mean, it's still, yeah, it's
yeah.
still what I've explored both in the 2012 book and in How Soon Is Now, which is I think there is the potential for a rapid evolutionary leap in human consciousness that would lead to a kind of global revolution that would lead to a kind of new social and economic system that was structured in such a way that it dismantled the current systems of oppression and domination. And I think that could actually happen in a faster, not that it will happen, it's a possibility, right? We're looking at possibilities, but it could happen in a relatively fast timescale. I mean, definitely, what we're seeing right now with these huge protests in the U.S., and of course, one main focus of them is, this horrendous overweening power of the police and their brutality against minorities and Black people. But underlying that is also a sense of the generalized system of oppression and the economic exploitation, that the system has created. And we're even seeing the way, like, I mean, I remember the Rodney King protests in '91 and how the mainstream media treated those protests. They were like, oh, they're riots, they're thugs and so on. The media, even the mainstream establishment media, is taking a much different tone now. So there's been a kind of, almost a radicalization, of everybody who's not, invested in this far right-wing ideology. It's becoming more and more clear that we're sort of facing this entrenched system of military police oppression that's funded, and created to benefit, a handful of super wealthy billionaires and their followers. And so that's kind of exciting because we could kind of actually see a coalescence, an international movement that links, kind of indigenous struggles, with, struggles of oppression, and orients itself towards a kind of transformation of the economic and social systems. A metaphor that was central to How Soon Is Now, and a lot of people have also used when thinking about, kind of the situation we're in, is the sort of caterpillar to butterfly idea. That somehow our civilization now is like, like a caterpillar in the chrysalis, which is, beginning to degrade and dissolve. And it turns out the way the caterpillar turns into the butterfly, I mean, you may already kind of know this, but as the caterpillar kind of melts down, it's not like the caterpillar just sprouts wings and turns into a butterfly. It's like the whole body of the caterpillar is sort of dissolving, and then there's a handful of imaginal cells in the caterpillar, like that begin to propagate out, and they can contain this program for this transformation. And the immune system of the dying caterpillar fights against them and tries to stop them. But somehow that leads those imaginal cells to strengthen and to find ways to overcome the kind of, attack against it, and ultimately reformulate, the organic material of the dying caterpillar into this butterfly that possesses, entirely new capacities from the caterpillar, the ability to fly. It's, now a pollinator rather than a consumer, and so on. It's, it's very beautiful and so on. So, you know, when I've been looking at all of these images of, you know, these super hyper militarized police and security forces and Blackwater guards and, you know, whoever the hell they are, you know, surrounding the Lincoln Memorial and so on. You know, it almost feels like we're an illustration of this whole concept of, like, you know, the protesters are like the imaginal cells that are, you know, gaining, you know, capacity and you know, gaining numbers, you know, while the you know, the immune system of the dying system is represented by the, you know, the you know, the dying by the military, you know, kind of police forces, you know, in some sense.
Mm. So you're seeing some patterns of yeah, patterns that compare to that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
nice one. All right. Sina, do you have any other questions that have come through?
It doesn't look like it.
Yeah, but one other question that I had is the systems design perspective. What is that? You mentioned that in the new offering, which is the here it is, the building our regenerative future. And that the URL for that is regenerativefuture.net. And when you were talking about that, you mentioned a systems design perspective, and I'm curious, like, as an evolutionary program, what exactly is that? What exactly is a systems design perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's you know, recognizing that you know, as I spoke about earlier, the kind of these different areas that often seem, you know, separate to people are actually all part systemically interlinked. You know, I mean, you know, racism, slavery, exploitation, exploitation of resources, exploitation of humans, domination, you know, control, like all of the you know, negative aspects of the capitalist, you know, industrial paradigm, you know, control of nature for profit, you know, control of water, you know, privatization of resources. You know, this is all one system, you know, that's developed, you know, over the last centuries. And yeah, we kind of have to think about, you know, what's the full spectrum alternative, you know. I mean, you know, I mean, I'm even, you know, I find radical, like the sort of kind of Murray Bookchin is a radical thinker who even questions whether, you know, private property is something that is you know, something that we can continue to have and also have a sustainable or regenerative human society. You know, I mean, we didn't always have private property. I mean, if you go to indigenous communities, you know, they don't even really believe in private property. I mean, they, you know, in practice, you know, people are allowed to keep their own homes and, you know, I mean, you know, their own possessions and so on. But there isn't this whole, you know, legal structure of private property. You know, I mean, you know, Rousseau back in the Enlightenment argued that, you know, kind of private property was the origin of exploitation, you know. So, you know, how would we move from the system we have now where, you know, private property is so built into everything? You know, is there a way we could, you know, I mean, and then this is once again, you know, the brain trying to problem solve, you know, whatever that's worth. But is there a way we could even use our information technologies and our communication networks to kind of like phase transition away from private property? You know, maybe not in like a month, but maybe over like 10 or 20 years. I mean, if we realize that you know, the construct of private property actually, you know, had an impact on our psychologies, and made us kind of unfree in our essence, and also incapable of yeah, constructing like a fully regenerative alternative to the current society system. you know, if that became a collective realization, then could we architect a phased transition away from it, where, you know, private land became more like land trusts, where, you know, cooperatives, you know, became more the norm, you know, where there was a kind of, you know, at least to some extent, an equalization of wealth and privilege, you know. So that's only one aspect, obviously, of the system design framework. But yeah, we have to look at, yeah, it's in my coat. We have.
Sina? There we go. Okay, I was just on mute.
Yeah,
Thanks for that, Daniel. That's been a very, very inspiring session, and it's been great to meet you via the Zoom with Tane Mahuta in the backdrop from New Zealand here, and yeah, all the way to you in Vienna, and looking forward to seeing how building our regenerative future moves forward, and connecting with you around that. Yeah, it's been great to hear some of your thoughts and ideas around where we're at and where we can go, and particularly inspired by what you mentioned around metamorphosis. And already part of me is thinking, wow, that would be a great theme for next year's festival. So yeah,
great, I love it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and yeah, please keep in touch with us, and if you're ever down in New Zealand around what is, I guess, your spring equinox and our autumn equinox, that's when Earthbeat takes place. So we'd love to have you at the festival as well.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for you know, making this time to share with me, and I really appreciate what you're doing. And it's great to be in contact, and I look forward to more. Yeah,
and Daniel, just before we leave, how did people get in touch with you? What's the best way if people felt inspired and called to reach out? Was that, are you active on Twitter? Do you have a site that people can go through? How can people connect with you? Yeah, I mean, I'm unfortunately, you know, hyperactive on Facebook, so people can always send me a message. I tend to use my private page the most, and you know, if they message me, I'll see it. And then we have the, as you mentioned, the regenerativefuture.net, where, you know, people can check out the course. They can also message us, and I'll respond to them there. We definitely offer reduced price and scholarship tickets to people who want to take the course, who don't have the, you know, financial means, you know, for the full price. And I'm on Twitter. You know, Facebook is a very good place to reach me. I mean, I have my own website, pinchbeck.io. You know, I have Instagram and all that stuff. But yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks again for your time, and yeah, hopefully we get to see you down in the Southern Hemisphere sometime in the near future. Yeah, I'd love to come back there. I was there once, and it was a very beautiful place to visit. Yeah.
Okay, well, enjoy the day in Vienna.
Thank you, guys.
Ka kite.
Ciao, ciao.